Good evening. My name is Sarah Howard. I'm the Youth and Community Services Manager here at the Danube Regional Library, and we're so glad you could join us tonight for this fun chess class. Tonight, Jason Delpire is here with us. He actually works here at the library with us, and he's our resident person that we go to when we have chess questions. So we thought this would be a fun thing to do. Our plan, of course, was to do it in person. So we're glad that he figured out a way to adapt this for us here tonight. So I'm going to magically disappear. We're going to wave at Jason. He's going to magically disappear too and share his screen. So enjoy and learn lots.
Okay, so thank you very much for attending this webinar. What I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about myself. As said, my name is Jason Delpire. I've been playing chess for about 25 years. I've been, I've taught a little bit. I'm a tournament director, played in over 40 United States Chess Federation tournaments. Long story short, I love chess, and I love to talk about chess and help people who are interested in improving their understanding of the game. So my goal for this will be to show you how to improve your understanding and play. My disclaimer is that I can't really tell you everything. Chess is just too big. So what I'll do is I'll be able to show you the way forward. As you can see, I have a board here that I can manipulate, move pieces and everything. Unfortunately, I will probably be moving too quickly through the material for you to set up your own board. I mean, you can try, but I think I'll be moving through a little too quickly. And like Sarah said, I'll send out a handout later on with some sites, some websites that I use and I think are good quality and helpful, and also a book list of titles that are helpful to the improving player, both titles that we have in our collection and also titles that we may be able to get to you through interlibrary loan. So the first thing I'm going to mention is sportsmanship, familiarity with the board, and an emphasis on chess notation. These are three things that I think are really important to the new player. So before COVID, we had in-person chess, and all the games started with a handshake and the competitor saying "good game" or "good luck." But now, with the changes, that's changed a little bit. But generally, what I'd like to say is, when you're playing in person or even online, be aware of your opponents, acknowledge their existence, say hello. This is a game for people who are, I guess, polite generally. But also remember to play the board, not your opponent. You can't judge your opponent's ability based on what they look like. For example, the youngest person to earn the Grandmaster title, which is the highest title in chess besides World Champion, was Sergei Karyakin, and he was only 12 years old. So you can't judge a book by its cover, especially in chess. And also, bad sportsmanship will just lose you competitors and potential learning partners. So next I'm going to talk about algebraic notation. And the first thing is, this is the board that you see the board here set up, and it's an 8x8 square. And it's made up of 8 files, which are the rows going up and down. And they are named by letter, so A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. Those are files. Then there's also what we call ranks, and these go left to right, right to left. And those are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So using this grid, you can know any square on the board by naming the letter and then the number. So for example, this is square D5, so D and 5, D5. This is G7, so on the G file, on the 7th rank, okay? So when writing notation, you would use the letter that we use for chess pieces, and we've shortened that to just an initial. So the king uses the letter K, the queen the letter Q, the bishop the letter B, the knight uses the letter N because the K is already used for king, and the rook uses the letter R. The pawns don't get a letter before the square because they're not technically pieces. So for example, if you were to move a knight to F3, this square right here, you would write knight to F3, N F3. So this is a little bit of a position here that there's a clarification issue. So these two knights can both move to the same square, to the D2 square. If you were to move this knight to this square, you would write the N for the knight, the B for the B file that the knight started on, oops, and then the D2 square where the knight ended up, okay? And likewise, if you were to move this knight to the square, it would be knight F, NF D2. There's also a situation where these two rooks can go to the same square. Okay. So these two rooks can make it to the same square, to the E4 square. If you were to move this rook, you would clarify by, say, rook RE E4. Okay. If you were to move this rook to this square instead, you'd be RA, because it was on the A file, to E4. Okay. We're going to move forward a bit with this position. Sorry, I'm moving the pieces around here so much. So we're going to move forward and show how to write a check. So the king moves. And now, if we needed to, like I was saying with the rooks going to the same square, here's another situation that if we wanted to move this rook to the square, or this rook to the square, the E5 square, we would have to clarify which rook is moving there. In this instance, we will move the rook on the 4th rank. So we'll say R, capital R, 4 E5. Okay. And if we move back, if we want to move the other rook, it would be R7 E5. Now, when writing a capture, we'll use the letter, in this case, this knight can capture this rook. We're going to use the letter N for the knight, and X stands in for the take, and then the square that the piece lands on. So knight takes E5. And then if we wanted to show a check, where this rook would move to this square to check the king, we would write a little plus sign behind it. So I'm going to, and there's one other position here when talking about notation, and I'm going to go over some games, so this will be a little bit more clear in a moment, but these are just the special things that may not be in the games that I'm talking about, and we want to know. So when we castle, there's two ways of castling. There's castling with black can castle to the king side, or white can cast, well, they can both castle to each side, but in this position, white would castle queenside. And you can see that it's written with 3 zeros because it's called the long castle. So we'll do that move, and then black can castle also, and because it's castling to the short side, the king side, it's 0-0. Now, a couple other moves that are kind of special that we want to know when we're dealing with notation. As you can see down here, if this pawn were to move to promote, you would tell the square that it's going to, in this case, A8, put an equal sign, and then the piece that it's promoting to. So you can see here with the queen, it turns into a queen. So that's one instance, one special move. There's also en passant. So if this pawn were to move 2 squares, black could choose to capture en passant. So we'll make that move. And then if black chooses to capture en passant, so it doesn't say it on here, but you would write a little EP after the move d takes c3 if you were writing out your notation. Unfortunately, the computer does a lot of nice stuff for you, but it doesn't do all the special things that you would do in person sometimes. So, for example, let's just do another thing. Let's do another check here. Rook to g1 check. And then if this pawn, because it's about to, it can capture and promote, will capture to, let's say, a rook. So we'd say the pawn that was on H, on the H file, takes G1 and is turned into a rook with check. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is really actually just playing chess. There are 3 stages to a game. They're not specific and distinct like quarters of a football game. So they sort of meld together, and sometimes you don't know exactly where you are. But there are some guidelines to tell you, kind of your goals in each section. They change as the progress of the game continues. So the first section is, or the phases are the opening, the middle game, and the end game. In the opening phase, your goal will be to develop pieces, which is move them from their starting squares and get them to the center. So here we have a little example of a potential game where we see white has moved a pawn, a knight, and a bishop, where they're developing pieces in a sensible way quickly. You want to get your pieces out of the way to castle and get your king to safety. That's another aspect of the opening. You're really not trying to win material in the opening. You just want to you don't want to keep your king in the middle. It's dangerous. In the second phase, the middle game, you will use all your pieces to fight for control of squares. Then you can try to win material and potentially checkmate your opponent, all the while hopefully hindering your opponent from doing the same to you. Lastly comes the end game. Usually in a game there are pieces traded or lost, and when there are less pieces on the board and the danger to the king has lessened, then the goal is changed from checkmating your opponent to promoting a pawn to a queen or whatever necessary piece, usually a queen, and that gives you a huge advantage. So the next thing is, I'm just really going to focus on the opening for this next part. Like I said, you want to develop your pieces quickly, actively, safely. You're generally not putting your pieces where they can be taken. You want to resist weakening pawn moves. And I have a few games, some example games we're going to go through really quickly, where you can see people who have kind of disregarded some of those basic opening principles, and they pay the price. And then so some of the things I want to mention is, if you notice the way this game, the position on this board, you see that they have moved a central pawn 2 squares. And what they're doing is they're trying to control and occupy the center, and they're attacking the center of the board with their pieces and pawns, trying to control the center. Think of the center of the board kind of like the high ground. You're not invulnerable, but controlling the center is an important aspect of chess. Your pieces have more mobility, and they're just more powerful in the center. Remember that control is different than occupation. You can occupy the center, but then have pieces and pawns move you out of the center, and then you lose that advantage of controlling the center. So here you see, and what I mean by the center, I'm going to go back to this. So these 4 squares, so the d4, e4, d5, and e5 are considered the center. And if you have your pieces in or around the center, you have a lot of mobility, and your pieces are more powerful. So generally, you will see players play towards the center. So if we just go through here, we're gonna continue with this game, and you see the developing of this bishop, and what it's doing in this case is they're fighting for this square. The knight has attacked this pawn is defending the pawn, and now this bishop is threatening to take the knight, weakening the defense of this e5 pawn. So back to the principles. So like I said, you want to control the center, develop your minor pieces, which are the bishop and knight. You want to get them out and prepare castling. You also want to eventually connect your rooks. So let's just go through this game. This is kind of some standard grandmastery chess play. And this is called the Rui Lopez. It's kind of one of the most common openings in chess. And what they're doing here is really fighting for control of these squares. Sometimes it doesn't exactly look like it, but they're this bishop is attacking some pieces in the center. So they're really that's the fight in the center here. So I don't want to go too far in here, but you can kind of see where this fight is happening, and you can imagine that after this move, you can see that potentially white is trying to play towards the king side, the king side, the side where the kings began, and black is gathering space on the queen side. And as you notice, the second move of this game was a knight. There's a saying, knights before bishops. And the reason they say that is because knights are slower pieces, and you kind of know exactly where they're going usually right away. Bishops have some freedom of where they can go There's a couple openings where you can play your bishop to c4 or b5. So the next thing about the opening is try to develop all of your pieces, get all of the pieces out there. You want to try to overwhelm your opponent with potential threats. Don't fall into the trap of relying on one or two pieces. A lot of beginners they fall in love with the power of the queen and the tricky knight, and they try to attack the opponent with just two pieces. Well, chances are, without some bad play by your opponent, that's not going to be enough material. So I'm going to go through what I was talking about, the mobility of the pieces here really quickly. And here's the difference between a knight being in this corner. It only has 2 squares that it can go to, versus this knight in the center has 8 squares. And this stands true for almost all of the pieces, that in the center they have more mobility, they have more influence on the game. And it just kind of goes to show that these pieces want to be in the center or pointing at the center. The bishops are kind of a different animal. They sort of like being a little bit further away. Their mobility really isn't so tied to the center. Also with the rooks here, they actually don't lose any mobility regardless of where they are, depending on pieces in the way, of course. And usually they're the last pieces to be developed. So they're generally a long distance piece. And of course, the queen, she's supremely powerful. She also wants to be in the center. But she can go all of these ways here. The danger, of course, with the queen is that she can be attacked, and then you have to move, and you'll end up wasting moves, which in chess is called time. And you don't want to waste some moves. So I'd like to go through this game. Through this game, it's one of the more famous games by a pretty famous chess player, Paul Morphy, who's an American chess player in the mid 1800s. And I think if you kind of watch how he plays as white, you'll see how a quick development using all of his pieces, and he does some high level stuff here, but I think it's a really good example of just good development and good play. And if you follow along here on the right side of the screen, you can see the notation. And you can kind of compare the notation from what I'm doing. If you have any questions about how notation works, I can kind of talk about that also. So this game starts out with e4, e5, knight to f3, attacking this pawn. d6, he protects this. His opponents protect this pawn. It's not particularly a great choice. It blocks this bishop for one, and he could develop a piece, as we saw in that other game. Could have developed this piece to protect this pawn also. So here, Morphy was always thinking about the mobility of his pieces, dynamic play. He wanted to get the pieces out and attack his opponent as quickly as possible. But he was also always aware of especially developing his pieces and finding the quickest way of doing this. So here you see he's opened up both of his bishops. He's opened up his queen. He's already, you could argue that he already has an advantage in this game. His opponents bring the bishop to g4, and what this is a pin on this knight. If this knight were to move, the bishop could take the queen. So that was their idea with that move. It's not particularly great. It can be dealt with pretty quickly. So here, he's technically threatening to win a pawn. If d takes e5, if d takes e5, queen takes queen, check, king takes, and then the knight can take the pawn there. We can go through that if it were, and then white would win a pawn. So not particularly great situation for black. So black decides to take the knight. Responds with taking with the queen. Take the pawn. Now here we have white has two pieces out developed, and there is a threat here of checkmate. So already 6 moves in through development, Morphy is threatening checkmate. So white defends it by putting a piece in the way. Now you can question this move a bit because he's moving the same piece twice, and it's kind of losing a little bit of time. But what this is a double attack, and you can see these two squares on this f7 square and this b7 square. He's attacking both of them and threatening to win a pawn. So black defends the f7 pawn. And here's where Morphy was different than most players of the time. He just developed a piece. He didn't always take the material because he knew that the developed pieces were more important than that one pawn. So this move protects this pawn. The queen can now eye this pawn. One problem, though, is that this is a natural square for the knight to go to, so that's a little bit of a problem. And I jumped some moves. Sorry about that. All right, so sorry. Here we go. So c6. Bishop g5, pinning the knight to the queen. b5, attacking this bishop. I think the opponents thought that he was just going to retreat the bishop somewhere, but Morphy was intent on developing his pieces and opening up the king. Yeah, he already had a plan. I'm sure that he knew what the rest of this game was going to look like pretty quickly. So he takes the knight, or takes the pawn, kind of sacrificing the knight. Black recaptures. Knight recapture, or bishop captures with check. Black develops the knight to block the bishop. Here we see now he's castled, and he's putting pressure on this square. So black protects the knight. And here's where the pin on the knight is important, because he takes the knight with the rook. Black can't take back with the knight because then he'd lose his queen. So he takes back with the rook, and now the rook is pinned to the king. The rook can't move, can't put your king in check. So he brings his last rook into the game, doubling up on this rook. Queen gets out of the way, so now this knight is free to move. Bishop takes d7, check. The knight can now move. And now is probably one of more of the famous continuations of a game. He sacrifices his queen. Only move is to take it with the knight, and then checkmate with the rook. So that's, if you look at this, the knight ended up back on its own. Well, I mean, technically, this knight started over here, but it ended up back on the first on his home row. The king hadn't moved, the bishop hadn't moved, the rook hadn't moved, and the queen was tied down to defense the whole time. So pretty much one of the more famous games of good, quick, sensible development. I want to go through another quick game And you can see where just a couple moves can really make a difference in how the game goes. And this is the danger of wasted moves. So e4, e5, f4. This is called the King's Gambit. Not to be confused with the Queen's Gambit. That's a different opening. So e takes f4. Now this is a wasted move. This is just it's just not a good move. It's just not a good move. The white has all this open area here, and they need to be aware of the king side, and you can see that this happens very quickly. With the queen check, there's really only two moves. There's either g3 or king to e2. I think they're probably both really bad, but they choose g3. Pawn takes g3. And then here's another just really bad move. I mean, you see no pieces developed by white. There's no time to waste, and they make another pawn move. This is a discovered check. So what happens is the pawn moves and creates a check on the king and attacks these two pieces. The king only has one move, and so queen takes e4. All of these squares with the circle, the king cannot move to, so it only has one move. And black takes the rook and does what's called under promotion, attacking the king. And this square was the only square that the king could not go to, or the king could go to before, and that's checkmate. I mean, you see that it's only a couple moves is all that's really needed. I'm going to skip ahead to this other this quick trap, and what I want to talk about here is this is kind of sort of a middle game issue, and I'm going to move on to the middle game a little bit. And says the moves that you choose in the opening will decide what type of middle game will come about. If there's pawns locked up and the pieces have limited mobility, or have you traded some pawns and the position is wide open, and allows players easy and freedom of movement. In the middle game, a number of factors to be aware of: piece mobility, space advantage, and center control. There will be a future program where I'll be able to discuss these things a little bit more clearly, because these are some really big concepts with a lot of in-depth discussion necessary. But like I showed you with the pieces in the center and how different they act when they have mobility. And if you have a space advantage, you can just imagine if you had freedom if you could wave your arms about, you'd feel much more free. Or if you were holding your arms to your chest, you would feel restricted. Same as in chess, restriction is not good for your pieces. It makes for a very difficult game. And I want to mention a book that discusses these things pretty in depth. It's a book by Jeremy Silman. It's called How to Reassess Your Chess. I don't think this one is in our catalog, but we can certainly get it through interlibrary loan. And also in the middle game, where those wasted moves like we saw before, they really come back to haunt you. And here's a really good example. We're going to go through this. So the e4, e5, knight to f3. You see the defending of the pawn with the knight. Here's the bishop c4. In the previous games, we developed the bishop to b5. In this particular opening, the idea is really to attack this f7 pawn. Gosh. Attack this f7 pawn. Let's go back. because it's very weak. It's only protected by the king. It's the only thing protecting it right now. So again, here we see kind of a weak move of the d6, developing the knight, pinning the knight. Here we what's called put the question to the bishop. Like, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? Are you going to go back? Are you going to go forward? And one thing I want to mention here is, and I think I'll talk about this in a little bit again also, when it's your move, you really want to be sure that you understand what your opponent just did. You want to know their plan before they do, hopefully. And here's a situation where I think Black just didn't quite take into consideration all the possibilities. So here again we see a knight taking a pawn, and it's opening up this attack on the queen. Now, you don't have to take the queen, and in fact it's a pretty, as you can see over here, it's a forced loss if you do. So in a situation like this as Black, you should really take some time and try to calculate this and make sure you understand what's going on with your opponent's moves. So if you take the queen, bishop takes f7 check. The only move for Black is to move to e7, and then knight to d5 is checkmate. And this is the Legal's trap. It's just a very common beginner's trap, so don't fall into it, please. Next thing, I'm just going to talk a little bit more vaguely about chess here. I want to talk about the piece value because I'm going to get to a basic board here. So in piece value, you may have seen that pieces are given a specific point value. Please remember that having a higher piece point total does not mean that you automatically win. You still have to checkmate your opponent or force a resignation. The unit of measure that we talk about is the pawn, and we give the individual pawn the value of 1. And moving on, each knight is given the value of 3, or 3 pawns worth. The individual bishop is also worth approximately 3 pawns. Though having both bishops, called the bishop pair, is worth a bit more. Sometimes people value it even up to 7.5 in worth, because they cover both of the color squares. As your bishops only are on one color square, so having both of them can be an advantage, especially in open positions. The rook is worth about 5 pawns, and the queen is generally considered to be worth 9 pawns. And you can see some really interesting what's called material imbalances. Sometimes a queen will be sacrificed for the 2 rooks, and that's generally an equal trade, even though the 2 rooks are valued at about 10 pawns worth. And one thing you want to be aware of is not all the pieces don't always they're not always valued at the same, depending on the position. Like I mentioned with the bishops like open positions where their full influence and their full mobility is available to them. Knights, on the other hand, are really good in closed positions where there are pawns that are blocking each other, and their ability to jump over the pieces comes out in as a real strength. So that's something to be aware of, that not always is a bishop and a knight worth the same. So the next thing I'd like to talk about really quickly is a pre-move checklist, is what to do when it's not your move. Because I think this is really important, that some people don't understand or they haven't been exposed to the thought process. So when it's not your move, what you're trying to do is you're trying to look for weaknesses. So if we go back to this Morphe game, let's just go back to this position. Sorry, let's go back to. So in this position, it's black's move, and white is going to be thinking, how can I take advantage of my development? What pieces are weak? So you can look at this pawn is still relatively weak. You're trying to formulate a plan of what your opponent could do. And I want to stress this, that you should always try to find the best move for your opponent when you're deciding a plan. Don't hope that your opponent doesn't see your plan. That's hope chess, and it's not winning chess. Winning chess is finding the best move for your opponent and playing against that, and always play the best move on the board. It just is. You're going to win more games playing the best move. And there's this saying by the third world champion Emmanuel Lasker. It's, when you see a good move, sit on your hands and look for a better one. Don't just play a good move. Don't just play a move because you think it's good. Verify. Look at the board and make sure. And also, when it becomes your turn. Next thing I'm going to be is when it is your turn. Don't just move because it's your turn because you can't think of something. Especially in the casual game where you're not playing with the clock and there's no time running out. Take a minute, think about it, make sure that your move is good. Don't just like, well, I had to move, so I moved, and that will get you in a lot of trouble. So your pre-move checklist on your time will be specific calculations. You're going to look at the board and say, okay, if he moves there and I move here and he moves there and I move there, that sort of thing. You may have multiple moves, so you're going to make multiple like mini plans and decide which one is the best move. And it's okay. You don't. So let's say in this situation here, where black has moved to b5, attacking this bishop, white is going to think, okay, my bishop is attacked. What do I do? I have some choices. I can retreat this bishop, or I could take the pawn, or I could take the pawn with the knight. And then at that time, Morphe would have done some calculations and said, okay, the knight move is the best move. I'm going to do this. And then he continues with his plan. So your checklist is make sure all of your pieces are safe. Is there anything attacked by a lesser value piece? Kind of like this position here. The pawn is worth less than a bishop, so you want to make note of that. You want to look for forcing moves. The forcing moves is if I do this, my opponent must do that. You want to look for checks, for potential captures, for threats that may happen next time. When starting out, I think you should look at all of the forcing moves, even the bad ones. Even queen takes b5, you might want to look at just to verify. You want to verify all of these because it's good practice. Eventually, when you get better, you'll be able to automatically know that some of these moves are bad, and you won't even consider looking into them anymore. But when you're beginning, I think it's good to kind of explore some of the things that you might think are bad moves. They might actually be brilliant if you take some time to look at them. Because tunnel vision can be a real problem. So, if you're focusing on, I'm going to get rid of these arrows. If you're focusing on playing against this square, you might be thinking about how do I get to the f7 square, when in reality your better opportunity was to try to play on this this idea of the knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, check. Tunnel vision is a problem in chess. So also on your move, when it's your move and you're thinking about what to do, If there are no forcing moves, if you know that there is nothing that is absolutely, I do this, he does that, then what you want to do is you want to try to undermine your opponent's pieces, kind of like this. You kind of like this. This b5 move is trying to undermine this bishop. However, there was what's called a tactical response to this move. Unfortunate for black. Next is, if your opponent doesn't have any pieces that can be threatened, then you want to improve the position of your least active piece. When talking about an active piece, think about what each of your pieces is doing. What if they're attacking something or defending something? Is it attacking an important square, or is it threatening to take another piece? Maybe a piece that's more valuable. Are you defending or an attack on your own king? If these aren't happening, and you have a piece that's not pulling its weight, try to get it into the action. So, like in this case, black should be thinking about, how do I get this knight or this bishop into the action, because they're not doing anything, and they have to get out of the way for the rooks to be in play. And next, after each move by your opponent, ask yourself, really, what is my opponent trying to do? Did that move threaten one of my pieces or my king? Especially, does it stop your own plan? Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you can just disregard that move. But you really do have to look at it to make sure that it did nothing. And as important as it is to have a plan of your own, it is equally important to recognize your opponent's plan. And always, every move must have a purpose. Like I said, don't just move because it's your turn to move. Try to really think about what that move can do for you. And if you've ever seen the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer, there was a line in there: "Don't move until you see it. Don't move until you've seen the best move." Ideally, you want to calculate about 2 to 3 moves ahead. 2 is good. Your move, a response, and then the response. Your second move is usually pretty good, especially when starting out. If you can do that and you can visualize it in your head, you will have a good start on improving your play. And like I said before, when calculating, always assume that your opponent will make the best move in response. I've seen a lot of players talk about a game or talk about an opening, and they say, well, if he does this and I do this and they do this, and like half of those moves that his opponent were playing were terrible moves. Well, that doesn't do you any good for your analysis. Lastly, don't just give away your material without purpose. Even a lowly pawn can make it to the other edge of the board and promote to a queen, and that's a huge advantage. Don't just think it's just a pawn. Sometimes it is just a pawn. You're going to hear this as you continue on learning about chess. Is it depends on the position. So the value of pieces depends on the position, the bishops, the knights, even the queen, the rooks, the knight, all of them. It depends on the position, their true value. So don't just give away pawns if you can avoid it. So next thing I'd like to do is talk a little bit about checkmate. Sometimes see beginners struggle with knowing how to checkmate when they have an overwhelming material advantage. And we go through this pretty quickly because it's pretty, when you have a queen and a king versus a king, it should be pretty easy. There are only a few instances where you have to worry about a stalemate, but there's some pretty quick techniques here you can use to quickly corral your opponent's king. So I'm going to start here with queen to b5, and what this does. What I like to do when I'm checkmating, there may be a quicker way in some instances, but I think this is the clearest, easiest way to remember, and it works nearly as well with the queen as it does with the rook. And what you do is you make this box and you confine your opponent's king into this box, and slowly make the box smaller, and then push the king to the edge of the board and checkmate the king. So again here, the king, as we saw, the king tried to stay roughly in the center, and we move our king up, still generally the center. Here we're still cutting off squares for the king, for the black king to run to. And here, now we have the king on the back rank. And now we have the king confined to the back rank. All it takes is moving the king up and checkmating your opponents. So make a box, make the box smaller, push the king to the edge of the board, bring your king up. No single piece can checkmate alone, so you need a teamwork between the queen and the king in this instance. I'm going to go to the rook next, so just the same rook, the one single rook, and we'll see the same basic technique of making a box and making it smaller. So here we have a box. Here we move our king up. Now this one's a little bit different because the rook is vulnerable to attack diagonally like this. We have to do some trickery. But here we've again made a smaller box. Bring the king up. Now we have our king, our opponent's king on the file here, where it can't move anywhere else because of the rook. And here we're gaining some space to move the king forward. There is a quicker checkmate, but I think the technique is important to see of how to checkmate with a rook. So you get the kings next to each other with one square in between. That's called the opposition. That's something that we'll hopefully get to in a moment. With two rooks, this is a ladder technique or a step technique, either way. So it's a little bit different than the square, but it's more like cutting off the whole board and then making the whole board smaller. There is still some square technique there. So now we see that we've cut off the king this way, and now we just move the rooks all the way to the other side of the board. Checkmate. We've done the rook. So here, this is going to be really quick, and I fear I'm not going to do this justice. But white to move here wins. There's a thing called the opposition. When the two kings are an odd number of squares away from each other, the king that is just moved has the opposition, and the opposing king has to move away. So if we look at here, there's one square in between. White has the opposition. The black king will have to move away. So we're going to go this way. So when the opposing king moves out of the way, you go the opposite way and bring your king forward towards the other side of the board. And when you get your king as far as it can and can still protect this pawn, then you start moving the pawn. So again, we have the opposition again. Move the king. Yeah, I mean, this is technically the king can go here, but so that's the opposition with the king and pawn. So here we have the same. This is black to move, so this is actually a draw because there will be no. We can just keep going here with the draw. You can't actually win this position when it's black to move. because black gets the opposition if we just go these. So the opposition is something that is also mentioned in that book, and also something I'll be talking about in the future. Another thing is the square of a pawn. So with white to move, if we look at the square, if the black king can be in the square, it can catch the pawn. If not, the pawn can make it to the edge of the board and catch the pawn. So I think that's about all the time. If there are any questions or concerns or any clarifications that I can do, I'm willing to answer some other questions here. One quick thing I just want to mention here. If you play online, yeah, actually there are chess clubs in Colombia. There are two that there's one that I know of specifically. It's in the it's on campus, on the Mizzou campus. And if you search for chess clubs in Colombia, so in the handout in the handout that I'll be sending, the United States Chess Federation has a website. I'm actually just going to show it to you. So uschess.org. This is the governing body of United States chess, and in this play tab, community. Where is it? There is a tab for. There's a tab for clubs. Chess clubs. There we go. So here you can look through city, state, wherever you may be, and find a chess club in your area. This is a site that all tournament chess players use. So we can see how did that? Oh, because I didn't put a distance. Sorry. So this University of Missouri chess club, you can contact them. You can find that through the USCF website, and I'll have a link to the US Chess site. Right now they're not meeting in person. They're still doing online play, and most of their play is on chess.com, where they meet virtually. So that's a good question. Were there any other questions or clarifications that I can go through? Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to. There was this thing I wanted to mention. Sure, I can explain castling. So back on, I'm going to go back to my study. So castling is a way to get your king out of the center, actually. So when you need to get your pieces out of the way, for example, I'll do this. White can castle kingside. If these pieces were out of the way, you can castle queenside. Basically what it is you move your king 2 squares and then put the rook on the other side of where that, on the other side of the king. So the king moved 2 squares, and then the rook moved to the other side of the king. It works the same way when I'm just going to make some moves here. it's the same for queenside, except I can't do that because I've already castled. Yeah, it's the same. It's the same method as on the queen side. So we just need to get all of our pieces out of the way. And the rule is, as long as the king hasn't moved, neither of your rooks has moved, and your king isn't under attack, and you can't castle through check or into check. There are a lot of rules, but they don't usually come up, especially if you castle quickly. If you get your pieces developed, you would castle to protect your king. Yeah, you would basically get two moves in one. You move the king and the rook at the same time. It's the only time that you would move two pieces at the same time. What openings would I recommend for beginners? Well, for white, I consider that the Rui Lopez probably the most sensible opening to study. I think opening principles are probably better when starting out than specific openings, though I understand the want to learn a specific opening. If you follow principles, generally you will fall into an opening. The Rui Lopez has been around for hundreds of years. I think it was in the 15th century that it was discovered that the first player played the Rui Lopez, named after a Spanish priest named Rui Lopez, and it's been played ever since. So for 500 plus years, people have been playing that opening. It's probably not going anywhere. How many variations to be studied? I mean, that honestly depends on a lot of things. So if we go all the way back and we want to talk about openings, so say you play this move, e4 is your first move, you'll have to know something, maybe not entirely in depth, but you have to know something for the move c6, which is the Caro-Kann, e6, which is the French defense, knight to f6 with the Alekhine defense, or Alekhine, c5, the Sicilian defense, e5, which can lead to the Rui Lopez. Even d5 is a playable move. There's so many moves, and it's if you get bogged down too much in opening study, the rest of your game will suffer. And openings, they kind of go by, they're kind of like a fad. Sometimes people get really intensely playing, grandmasters get really intent in playing a specific continuation, and then amateurs like us look at that and be like, oh, I should play that opening, but really you don't need to. You kind of play what you like. There's enough information out there for you to find any opening. I mean, and this is just really any order of moves has a name, is an opening. So white can even open with the d pawn, the c pawn, knight to f3 is a move. G3 is a move, b3 is a move, f4 is a move. They're all valid to some extent, and it's just a matter of honestly what you see as you play. You kind of prepare for what you expect. For example, when I play, I have ideas. Like I play c4 now, the English opening. So in reality, I need to know something about knight to f6, c5, e5, and some minor variations in there. Yeah, how many variations to study is such a big question. Um, um, yeah, it's just yeah. Were there any other questions? And as you can see here, again, we'll just reiterate that generally knights move before bishops in most of these lines because we know where the knights are going to go. The bishops, usually we don't until our opponent makes some responses. So the last thing I just want to do really quickly here is sometimes when people start playing online, they get a screen like this, and this is a search. This is a search bar, search graph, and all of these. I just want you to know that if you play online, these are all time controls, and you can see that they're different numbers. This 1 plus 0 is a 1 minute game, meaning you have 1 minute to make all of your moves. This 2 plus 1 is a 2 minute game where you get 1 second added to your time after each move. So these are really quick games. I think personally, when you're just starting out, well, actually, everyone should be playing longer games. You get the opportunity to think longer, make better plans. These games, these really fast games, even though they're fun and they're over quickly, so you can play a bunch of them, you're not thinking very in depthly, and you can fall into some habits, some bad habits of playing for tricks rather than playing really good moves. And in these longer games, really around this 10 plus 5, you can do some thinking in those games and really make some plans and play real chess. This is like, these 1 minute games are like popcorn or potato chip chess. You just have a bunch of them. Yeah, tricks are for kids. It's just you want to play real good moves all the time, and in these games, they just devolve into who can make the moves fastest so they can win on time, and it's a bad habit to play in. For example, I played a tournament a long time ago, and my opponent was running out of time, and I fell into the trap of playing fast moves, making him play on his time as his time was ticking down. And unfortunately, my opponent was much better than I am, and he was able to think much more quickly than I could. The best move you can make with a queen is checkmate. Honestly, a safe move. I would think more about plans in general than specific moves. You want to make a plan. Like when I was showing about looking at a game and looking at a position and making a plan for your next few moves. What happens if white just played d takes e5. So on your move, you're thinking, okay, what am I going to do if black takes d takes e5? Or what am I going to do if bishop takes f3? Or what am I going to do if he plays a different move? Maybe he plays knight to c6. That's one of the things you want to do on your move. You kind of don't want to think about one piece. Think about all of your pieces together as a team. Try to overwhelm your opponent with pieces. Was there anything else I can help?
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our program. We're so glad that you all could join us tonight. We'll get our screens put back up here and remind you that we also will have a recording that we will email out to you. And the plan is that we'll have a second part in March and a third part in May, and we'll just keep going as long as there's interest. This has been great. I've learned a lot, and this is the second time I've heard it, so I'm still learning. So don't get discouraged if you're a brand new chess player. Just keep going. It is worth it. Trust me, it is worth it to learn this game. It's helpful
Yeah,
in all parts of your life. You wouldn't think it is, but just thinking ahead several moves
absolutely.
helps you in other parts of your life as well. So big thanks to Jason for figuring this all out, and we hope to see you next time, and go out and have a good game.
Thank you so much.